Good morning. I've been asked to do a little bit of a tutorial on inks this morning. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit first of all about stamps. There are a couple of three different types of stamps. You may find your stamps come as rubber. Essentially both of these are rubber. This one is an older style rubber stamp and it is wood mounted. This one is one of the newer styles of rubber stamp and it's what they call cling mounted. So it just means that you will need to use, or we will need to use, an acrylic block to stamp with that this morning. So I'll just fix it onto an acrylic block there. We'll just pop those to one side. The other sort of stamp that you'll come across quite a lot is the clear stamps. Now the clear stamps are great because they take up very little space. They're usually fairly inexpensive and easy to use. However, there are a few little tricks to getting a clear image with them. So you've removed the stamp that you're going to use from its backing sheet, which sometimes is easier said than done. There we go. That got the little fella off. We're just going to mount him onto an acrylic block so we're ready to go stamping. Now, first of all, the discussion on the internet was talking about the different uses between distress ink and varying other inks, Archival being one of them. Distress ink, it's a great ink, but it's better for using for techniques rather than actual stamping. All the inks I have today, with the exception of one, are actually black ink. My inks are a bit abused because they get used for classes, but that's okay, we can still continue on with those. So when you're stamping, you're applying the ink to the stamp, then stamping the ink. So my ink here is probably a little bit on the dry side. It's probably a bit of an older pad, but we've got a fairly clear image with that one. However, when I come across to the distress ink with the clear stamp, you can already see that it's sort of beading up on the surface of the stamp. That's because distress ink is a water-based, slow-drying dye ink. So it doesn't really like to sit on the clear stamps. So we just pick up a little bit more ink and I'll just stamp that image, and you will see you don't get, it stamps and it's okay, but you don't get a really clear image. The edges of it tend to be a little bit on the fuzzy side. So that's the distress. As I say, it's water based, it's a slow drying dye ink, and because of that you can use it with alcohol markers to colour in, etc. So it's got its uses, and for your distress techniques it is fantastic. I'm going to use the Archival last because I'm going to do all the water based ones, and you'll see why in just a moment. So the Memento is another one that I like, mostly because it is water based. It tends to bead up slightly less. So this is the Memento, it's by Eco. There is a new Memento ink out which I've yet to try, the Memento Luxe, which I'd be very keen actually to give a go, so I might well have to order some of that in. Again, rubber. Again, it's fine. It does its job. It's actually a clearer stamped image than the distress ink, and actually a really poor image. So this is the card with the distress ink, this is the card with the Memento ink, and it's just an awful lot fuzzier. So you can see both the distress and the Memento work really well with your general rubber stamps, but are not so great with your acrylic. I will, however, tell you about a cheat for that in a moment. Memento ink is, again, water-based. It's a dye, which means it's translucent. It's fantastic for colouring with alcohol markers like your Copics and that sort of thing. So it's great for that. Alright, I'll just put that to one side for a second. Then we're going to move on to the oil-based. There's two different oil-based. Now, cleaning your stamps, before I move on, cleaning your stamps, you can already see there's very, very little ink left on that at all. I'm just using a Chucks that I've run under the tap it's just water. You don't have to get fancy. If there's still ink on it, it's not the end of the world. It's going to be okay. And in fact, you can see that one doesn't come off anymore at all anyway, which is okay, that's fine. So, the Versafine. This one I only actually have in-house in vintage sepia. Versafine is a little bit different. It is an oil-based ink. It's a pigment ink, which means it's great for watercolouring. Now, usually pigment inks we tend to stay away from. They're kind of slow drying, but this is a bit of an unusual hybrid. You get really beautiful, crisp images. And because it's an oil-based, oh crap, stamp in there, Rachel. Because it is a pigment ink, you do get a beautiful crisp image. Sorry, an oil-based ink, you do get a beautiful crisp image. You don't get that beading up on the stamp at all, and you will get remnants left on the stamp, which if you wipe it off when it's wet, it comes off and it's not a biggie. However, here's where my little tip comes in. Moving on to the Archival, which again is oil based. It's actually a dye ink, so it means it's translucent. Talk about translucency, because if you're trying to stamp on a dark coloured paper, if an ink is translucent, it's not going to be very bright. You're not going to notice it so much. So your oil based dye ink, the Archival, again with your little clear stamp, you're going to get no beading up on the surface, stamps beautifully, crisply and clearly. I will do a comparison with these images in just a second. With your rubber stamps, it stamps beautifully, crisply and clearly. Now, if you are to leave this ink on this stamp, what it actually does is it will seal the surface of that stamp. So then if you go to use it with your distress or your water-based ink pads, it will improve the stamp. So if you've got a whole heap of clear acrylic stamps sitting at home that you think I'd really like to use with my distress, because I've actually got that in a green and I really want to use a green, stamp a bit of Archival first, let it sit, let it dry, then stamp it with your green, because I tell you now, it will work an awful lot better. And I learnt that from Tim Holtz himself. So just a little tip from the top. So here's the comparison of those images. That's the Ranger Archival compared with the Distress, and you can see, I hope, the quality of my image, the quality of the images. The Archival is a far better stamping ink. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about a fifth type of ink, Stays On. Now, Stays On is widely recommended and everybody loves Stays On. However, I do love Stays On. It's different again. The oil-based stamp pads are not going to harm your stamps at all. Stays On will. If you leave a clear stamp with Stays On it and come back to it in a couple of months' time, you'll have holes in your acrylic in the actual stamp surface, so you will basically have ruined it. Stays On does produce a nice crisp image. It really is comparable in stamping to the Archival. Smells like almonds, and a lot of people don't like the smell. I think the smell's divine. So that's a comparison between the Memento, which was the water-based, and the StazOn. And my camera really does not like these fluorescent lights. It often makes it quite flickery, so I'm apologising now. And I will also put these up as images, so if you really can't bear to watch this, that's fine. Alright, the nice thing about StazOn, the thing that I use StazOn for the most, stamping onto acrylic. So I have a little bit of acrylic here. Picked up some StazOn on my stamp. There is an absolute art to stamping though on acrylic, and it requires a massive amount of practice. I find it incredibly difficult to get an absolute crisp, clear image. However, it looks kind of cool, and particularly if you don't mind if it's a little bit wafty. Worst case scenario, you can wipe it off with some alcohol and start again. And that brings me to clean up with StazOn. You actually have to be incredibly aware of cleaning up your stamps. As I say, StazOn will eat these stamps. If you wipe it off quick, you'll get it off with just water, and that's absolutely fine. As I said, this is all I've got on this chucks, just a little bit of water. It's worthwhile just sitting, have chucks on hand when you do your stamping, and all you've got to do is just wipe over your stamp and then it's clean. But if you leave StazOn on these, they will get eaten and they will get destroyed. I've actually lost numerous ones. But anyway, I hope that little guide helped.